When training an artificial neural network, an algorithm called gradient descent searches for the lowest possible point of error. The system often fails when the node becomes trapped in a local minimum, a shallow valley where it repeats a suboptimal pattern, unable to see the broader topological landscape. We accept this structural failure in machines, yet human consciousness is often viewed through the lens of chronological bias. This is the assumption that because ancient philosophers lacked modern data centers, their descriptions of the mind were restricted to subjective, belief-based mythology. Gnostic traditions and early mysticism function as rigorous, non-empirical system sciences. These texts utilize a highly technical structural language to map the internal architecture of human behavior. These ancient thinkers were charting the same systemic dynamics that modern engineers study today.
They utilize narrative as their primary data storage technology, encoding complex observations into transmittable stories. This suggests that the mystic in a desert cave and the modern AI engineer are mapping the exact same territory. The only factor separating their work is the specific vocabulary they use to describe it on religious context. Heraclitus defined the logos as the underlying structural order of the universe. It represents the predictable relational dynamics, balance, conflict, and feedback that govern any organized system, regardless of its material components. In the 20th century, the new science of cybernetics formalized these dynamics. Thinkers like Gregory Bateson and Norbert Wiener provided a new technical mode of description for these universal principles of communication and control.
Bason's relied on the principle of isomorphism. This is the observation that a true structural reality will map perfectly across different domains, biological, mechanical, or psychological, without needing to alter the definitions. Isomorphism serves as a test for objective truth. A subjective metaphor relies on loose similarities, while an isomorphic structure preserves its exact operational logic even when the surrounding language changes. Truth is indicated by the persistence of form across vocabularies. If a pattern is real, it remains visible whether it is described by a software engineer or an ancient philosopher. We can verify this persistent form by tracking a master sequence of behavior across 3 isolated domains. In systems engineering, a PID controller in a self-driving car follows a clear sequence. It establishes a reference trajectory, identifies an error vector, processes that feedback, and triggers a structural reorganization. In modern psychology, the sequence holds. A human expectation meets a cognitive bias, resulting in a locked-in habit loop. Eventually, awareness provides the feedback necessary for behavioral change. Ancient spiritual terminology maps onto these exact nodes. The Greek framework of aim, hamartia, bondage, and metanoia follows the same operational logic. The word hamartia, commonly translated as sin, is an archery term. It literally means to miss the mark. Historical institutions eventually mutated this term. They detached it from its mechanical origins and reinterpreted it as a permanent moral stain, turning an operational description into a tool for external control. The term hamartia describes a structural execution error. It is a mathematical deviation from a target, independent of the individual's identity or character.
This structural mapping challenges the belief in willpower. We treat willpower as an independent fuel source that can override biological impulses through sheer force. Benjamin Libet's readiness potential experiments provide a different view. His data showed a massive buildup of electrical activity in the motor cortex, occurring hundreds of milliseconds before the subject reported a conscious choice to move. The biological machinery initiates the action before the subjective feeling of choice arises. The conscious mind observes the finish line of a process it did not start. This neurodata corresponds to the Gnostic myth of the demiurge. In the myth, the demiurge is an ignorant, false creator god who sits downstream of reality, but arrogantly claims to be the supreme ruler of all things. The human ego functions as the demiurge. It is an internal PR department that provides narrative coherence after the fact, rather than a central commander executing control. The archons in Gnostic myth function as the planetary wardens that block the soul's ascent. This is a technical description of boundary conditions. the situational cues and deeply myelinated habit loops that prevent a system from reorganizing, locking it into a repeating, suboptimal configuration. Willpower is a structural illusion. It is the ego attempting to use a misaligned configuration to fix the very misalignment it is a part of. If willpower is a flawed model for change, how does a biological system actually alter a destructive habit? The mechanism of change is visibility. A behavioral pattern requires the absence of conscious friction to operate efficiently. It relies on being unseen by the system it is running in. Gnosis is the precise moment a system recognizes its own automated loops in real time. This recognition introduces friction into the mechanical sequence. Once the system observes its own architecture, its internal weights naturally adjust. It can no longer execute the old program with the same efficiency because the data has changed. This natural recalibration is metanoia. It is a structural reorientation of the system, allowing for a new trajectory based on accurate internal data. Agency is found in exposing the system to itself. By making the pre-conscious patterns visible, the system is allowed to naturally outgrow the error. Achieving this level of visibility requires high-fidelity data about how systems fail. External observation is mathematically flawed for this purpose. When you watch others, you only see surface outputs, which forces you to invent biased narratives to explain their internal motivations. The only high-fidelity dataset is the self. You must rigorously retain the memories of your own past failures, using the former self as an archive of structural distortion. The betrayal of Judas maps this internal event. It is the moment the rigid, hypocritical ego is fully exposed to the light of its own contradictions. The collapse of the old ego is a structural requirement. The outdated configuration must terminate its control to allow the new, aligned system to run. Retaining these internal crash logs replaces moral judgment with cybernetic recognition. When you identify the glitching loop in yourself, you gain the capacity to recognize it in others without the need for condemnation. Ancient myths provide the precise operational schematics required to debug human consciousness. They are maps of the logos, the unchanging order that persists long after the vocabulary of the ancients has faded.